Quentin L. Cook is a member of the elite body of 12 apostles of the Mormon Church. I have no argument with what he is saying here. In fact, I agree with it. And indeed, what you're about to see, I have no argument with this at all. My problem with this Mormon view of religious freedom is the sheer and blatant hypocrisy of this flagrant institution that abuses its own members' right to a religious opinion. But to further make my point, let's listen to more of the official public smokescreen that the church seems to promote. Then we shall look at the sleight of hand.
There is a battle over the meaning of that freedom. The contest is of eternal importance, and it is your generation that must understand the issues and make the efforts to prevail.
Religious freedom is the right to practice your faith, to have a faith, and to manifest it publicly and in private, and without having someone stopping you and say you can't do that.
It's also the right to act and to interact with people of different faiths, both in private and in public, in a way that's consistent with your religious convictions.
People can make it sound very persuasive that, well, as long as you can believe what you want, then the rest of it doesn't really matter. But if you can't manifest your beliefs, then they lose a great deal of their meaning.
And as the U.S. State Department recently said, religious freedom is essential to human dignity, and it correlates strongly with economic development and with stable democratic societies. I think we're currently seeing increased threats to religious autonomy, which is eroding our right to religious freedom. Certainly in the context of colleges and universities, we're seeing more and more policies that are being set that would require religious student organizations to have leaders that are non-believers. And these policies are forcing these religious student groups off campus. There are religious teachings on the family. Freedom of conscience is the right to not be forced to do something that violates the truth that God has spoken to your heart. And so it's that freedom of conscience that undergirds this freedom of religion.
It's astounding to hear this kind of language from the Mormon Church. I can only understand it by assuming that talk like this is a smokescreen for the Mormon Church to abuse the freedoms of its own members. The Mormon Church maintains strict control of its message. If you are a Mormon, you dare not publicly declare a belief that runs contrary to the teaching of the Church, or they will simply excommunicate you. The Mormon Church has broken all of its own rules. Firstly, you don't have the right to form individual statements of faith from within Mormonism. You certainly can't express those views openly. Secondly, the Mormon Church tells its members that they are entitled to personal beliefs, but they must remain private and must not be discussed with anybody, certainly not publicly, and this restriction even exists amongst family members. Thirdly, the Mormon Church shuts down members who make public their views if those views are contrary to the Mormon Church's teachings. They are simply excommunicated. Fourth, there has always been an incongruence between what the Church states publicly and private practice. This was true of Joseph Smith in the 1800s, and it's true today. Beware of the public declarations of the Mormon Church. There is almost always an ulterior motive. And lastly, number 5, bear in mind that within Mormonism, man is made for the church. The church is not made for man. The members of the church are there to serve the church. Now, I would suggest that Jesus would say differently, because Jesus was talking about the Sabbath. He said that the Sabbath was, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. And we can extrapolate from that also, that his church should be there for people, not the other way around. So let's look at some examples of Mormons who've been recently kicked out of the church for expressing alternative Mormon beliefs. First up is this man, John Dehlin. He's a lifelong Mormon. He served a mission, he was married in the temple, he gave 10% of his earnings to the church. He's also the founder of a popular podcast, Mormon Stories, and he's been extremely influential in helping those, including myself, who experience a crisis of faith. He's a good man. He considers himself a believer. He's conducted hundreds of interviews with believing Mormons and those who are not so believing. John himself has expressed some views that perhaps some of the events in the Bible and the Book of Mormon may be allegorical rather than literal, but he's tried to keep a balanced approach in his podcasts. These views by him are by no means conclusive as far as John is concerned, but he remains committed to the teachings of Jesus, and he has acknowledged that he values his membership in this church. Yet they kicked him out, ostensibly for apostasy, but many other Mormons share his views. The truth is that John Dehlin is very popular, and he's very vocal, and the church doesn't like that. Now, I don't expect the church to agree with everything that he has to say. I don't agree with everything that John Dehlin says. I don't expect them to like what he has to say. I'm not asking them to like what he has to say. They're entitled to disagree or even be angry. But I do object to him being thrown out of the church for simply publicly expressing his religious views, especially when the church is spouting out about religious freedom and how everybody has the right to express their own views in a public forum safely. When a church excommunicates a member, what they are saying is that in the hereafter, in heaven, they can never live with God again. This it runs contrary to everything that is reasonable. This is the very thing that the Mormon Church says is enthusiastic about protecting, that of religious freedom. One definition of pharisaism is not practicing what you preach, showing a certain face to the world and another when no one is looking. And this is certainly what the church is doing. Kate Kelly is also a believer. She's a woman who would like women to hold the priesthood. She says that she respects the voice of the prophet and wants the prophet to keep asking the Lord to allow the priesthood to be bestowed upon women, and to keep on asking him until the Lord himself is wearied and grants her request. Now again, I do not necessarily agree with Kate here, nor do I think the church should cave into her request. The church has a right to state what it believes. The church believes that the priesthood should be endowed upon men only, and that's fine. However, I acknowledge that Kate should have the right, even within the boundaries of the church, to state her religious views, and to state those religious views publicly. The church makes its views public, but Kate Kelly was excommunicated. Rock Waterman is another man who I think got it wrong. He believes very much that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God and that the Book of Mormon is true. But he also believes that the church has effectively apostatized from its original Restoration Manifesto. Again, I don't personally follow this line of argument, but I think it's wrong to excommunicate him for which he was. Finally, this married couple, this is Carson and Marissa Calderwood, they were recently excommunicated for apostasy, simply for publicly expressing their views. The Mormon Church have 13 articles of faith. These are 13 rules or standards that the church holds sacred and claims to live by. They are part of the standard works of the church, and they are central to the teachings of Mormonism. Now, the 11th article of faith says this: we claim the privilege of worshipping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. That's the 11th article of faith. Now, there is no disclaimer here that says this is only true if you're not a Mormon. It says that all men, and we can extrapolate from this means women also, whether they be Mormon or not, they should be able to worship how, where, or what they may. I also want to point people to the strange case of, I don't know how you pronounce it, Pelatiah Brown, who is well known to Joseph Smith. Now, Brother Brown, back in the 1800s, advanced some ideas about the interpretation of the Revelation of St. John. You know, the book of Revelation. It's a massively symbolic book at the end of the Bible that Christian hobbyists have for millennia interpreted and applied to a vast variety of world figures. You know, the beast, for example, has been declared to be everyone from the Pope to President Jimmy Carter. Pelatiah Brown had his own views that he expressed back in the 1800s, and he was brought to book for it. The High Council took exception to what he was saying and sought to discipline him by the church for his views and to kick him out of the church. They undertook to censure him because of his teachings in relation to the beasts he was talking about. Whether they actually corrected him or not, I'm a little doubtful, but I don't care. Joseph Smith himself, the prophet, didn't like this. He didn't like Pelatiah Brown being disciplined because he expressed his own views. And this is what he said. He said, "I did not like the old man being called up for erring in doctrine. It looks too much like the Methodists and not like the Latter-day Saints. Methodists have creeds which a man must believe or be asked out of their church." And this is what the Mormon Church does today. "I want the liberty," says Joseph Smith, "I want the liberty of thinking and believing as I please. It feels so good not to be trammelled." Now, trammelling, what Joseph is referring to there, trammelling is what people did with horses to control their horses. And what they would do is they would tie rope, a single length of rope around all four legs with some slack so the horse could walk or move. Now, if you gave more slack, of course, the horse may be able to trot, but not gallop. It was a way of restricting the movement of the horse, a way of controlling the horse. And Joseph Smith said, it feels good not to be trammelled. It does not prove that a man is not a good man because he errs in doctrine. Now, that's a very interesting statement from Joseph Smith, because what he's saying is that people inside and outside the church should not be trammelled, should not be restricted. They should be allowed to have their own views. The other thing that I think is interesting about that quote is Joseph Smith is more interested in whether a person is a good person or a bad person, not whether he's got the correct doctrine or not. The implicit or explicit claim then made is that Joseph Smith would be opposed to subjecting those who teach and advance false doctrine or seek to undermine the church, its leaders, members, to church discipline. Now, this is something that church leaders need to consider. They need to avoid this sort of paranoia of setting the boundaries for the church and kicking out people who they don't like.